As the Isle of Man finally signs up to the Paris Agreement, Agenda asks, is it worth the paper it's written on? The Infrastructure Minister gives us some insights into road tax and looks forward to its future reform. And former chair of the MUA explains the electricity price hikes. This week we've got 3 interviews that I've not been able to squeeze in on previous shows, but reckoned you'd like to hear. So, to begin with, Tim Johnson was just leaving his role as MUA chair to become Enterprise Minister when I asked him about the legacy he's leaving new MUA chair Tim Krukell MHK.
Look, this has been an ongoing challenge, Phil, for a couple of years. If we can cast our minds back to even before Ukraine was invaded by Russia, gas prices were already running at 3 or 4 times what we saw traditionally, and we'd seen very stable wholesale gas prices for years, running between that sort of 30 to 60, 70 pence a therm for years. That is basically where we were. And all of a sudden we saw these changes coming post-COVID, big changes, big demand in Asia, for example, for gas. We saw a lot of maintenance going on in Europe. There's some very cold weather. Prices were already starting to go up. And then we had this major issue in Ukraine. And I think sometimes we have to, as an island, as a community, just stop and look up and look out sometimes and just look at what's going on globally and understand that some of the effects that we're all facing are things way out of our control. Gas prices have been up to 10 times what they've been historically, and they were last autumn. Yes, they've come down a great deal, and I know some of the questions are about, well, gas prices are coming down, why are electricity prices going up? Because yes, gas prices are coming down, but they're coming back down to a level that's still 3 or 4, 5 times more than they were historically. And ultimately, Manx Utilities as a business, buying that gas, it uses that gas to make electricity, it cannot function paying a price for a product and not getting a return back from it in tariffs. We've done it for a period of time, and we've absorbed huge amounts of resource doing it, but we can't do it indefinitely. And that is where we are today. Now, going forward, yes, we're going to see tariffs go up from 22p to 28p and then up to 34p in July. All I can say is that's tough and that's really difficult for all of us, and I accept that. In the context of where things are globally, look at the UK, we're still going to be having the lower electricity prices than the UK, but I accept that living here today, that doesn't help. So there's no point going on about that. It's going to be difficult. But all we're trying to do is making sure that we've got a business that can function and go forward.
And you say lower electricity prices than the UK. Is that entirely correct?
Well, at the moment, if you look at the moment, I think the average domestic price in the UK is around about 32 pence a unit. Okay, we're paying 22 at the moment. It'll be going up to 28 on the 1st of April, and it'll be going up to 34 on the 1st of July. Now, the Ofgem cap in the UK at present is, I think it's around 34p. It's going up to 40p in July. So our price will still be becoming below the UK Ofgem prices.
In relation to this, should government have done more? I mean, there was a £29 million loan offered, but should that not have just been a grant from government to the MUA to help deal with the immense problems that people have been facing over the last year or so?
Well, ultimately, it was up to government how that panned out. If we go again back to the last summer when the MUA, the board at the time, obviously I wasn't involved at that stage, having discussions with government, they were making it very clear to government that tariffs would have to go up 70-80% to try and for the business to go forward. It was very much a government decision that mustn't happen. They brought forward that £26 million option and the price freeze that we're still in today. At that time, gas prices were 5, 6, 7 times the normal. Now, what we saw over the winter, as I say, is those gas prices have fallen quite considerably. So what it meant was that Manx Utilities was able to maintain its business as usual through its own resource, and it didn't need to draw down on that £26 million loan. Now, of course, if we take that £26 million, it is a loan, it still has to be paid back. So ultimately, all we're doing is delaying further tariff increases further down the line. And when there's no sign of wholesale prices returning back to what we knew historically, then if we knew those gas prices were going to fall very quickly, you might look at it differently. But that's not looking like it being the case. So all we're going to do is mean we're going to have to pay that back in tariffs at a future date. So we're just passing the buck to down the line, which is not helpful, and adding more debt to the bottom line of Manx Utilities.
This government is into its second year, well into its second year now, and we're still not seeing any major developments, any significant moves to substantially insulate the homes on the island, to introduce other energy-saving measures. There's a lot of tinkering, but not really enough to address some of these long-term issues.
I think, as we said earlier, if you look back historically where gas prices were, they were very stable for many, many years, and bottom line is that at that time there wasn't really the demand to do that. I mean, again, we go back to discussions back in the mid-2000s about renewable energy, and again, when you priced it against the existing gas price at the time, which was running around about 30 to 40 pence a therm, it just didn't stack up. Renewables always looked expensive. Now we're in a new world. Things are changing, and the reality is now that we do need to make change. Hindsight, absolutely. You look back and these things should have happened, but they didn't. And I was certainly critical in previous role as President of the National Farmers Union to government for what I felt is 10, 15 years of lack of vision, really, which has put us really behind the curve, I believe. But what are we doing now? We've got our 30 megawatts of onshore renewables, which is now being put in place to start as soon as possible. 10 megawatts of solar and 20 of wind. So we're starting. But yes, this should have been done a long time ago, but it wasn't. Reality is we're here now, and it's catch-up time, and that's what we need to do.
That was Tim Johnson in his last interview as MUA chair. Rob Mercer, MLC, made some thoughtful comments on climate change in March Tynwald. What does he think about the Isle of Man signing up to the Paris Agreement?
I think it first was mentioned back in November 2021. So obviously a lot of time elapsed since then, but good to see it finally appear. Well, it means that our obligations line up with that, with 195 other nations around the world. And I think it's a recognition that our endeavours to address climate change through the Climate Change Act have been recognised by the signatory body, which of course is the UK.
It's fair to say that many countries who are signatories to the Paris Agreement are far from observing all the relevant actions described in the agreement. Is it actually worth the paper it's written on?
Yes, I think so. There is a benefit to collective action. We're all in this boat together. And to have so many sign up, and yes, at this point in time, there's probably a gap between what people say they're doing and what's actually happening. But I still think there's a great benefit in that collective agreement being in place.
In relation to actions of the Isle of Man government, I mean, you mentioned that this probably recognises the steps that we are taking. You had some interesting comments to make in relation to the final item on the Tynwald Order paper, on the March Tynwald Order paper, and this was effectively watering down reporting requirements in relation to actions by small bodies relating to climate change.
Yeah, I got the sense that, and the thing I was disappointed when on first reading of those regulations was this did appear to be a watering down. And I think I made the point that it felt as though the first actions by public bodies were to lobby to have the reporting requirements reduced. And that seemed inconsistent to me.
And yet it appeared more to be the department asking small bodies whether they really wanted to do this. Certainly from the small body that I'm engaged with, there was no lobbying at all. It was just a case of the department asking, do we want to do less reporting than had originally been intended? Who actually was lobbying for these reductions in reporting requirements?
I don't know actually, but I certainly got the sense from talking to the Climate Transformation Board and team, that there have been that they felt it more important to bring public bodies with them rather than to get too much in the way of pushback. And that's what persuaded me in the end to say, well, let's not wait for perfection here. Are these regulations better than what we have at the moment? And for me, the answer was yes, and that's why I voted for them. I'd still like to see them more demanding, because I think we do need to take greater strides towards meeting these objectives.
Do you think that government is showing strong enough leadership in relation to addressing climate change?
Well, we've spoken on this before, and I've always told you that I'm an optimistic person, and I think looking at the progress that government has made, I think we have to give them the benefit of the doubt here, because there's lots of steps that have been made, that are happening, that are concrete things, and those do give me encouragement. And I still have that optimism, but we need to keep an eye, and we need to keep the level of scrutiny up to make sure that the promises being made are being backed up by action.
You can be optimistic but point to areas that could do better or need improvement.
Absolutely.
And are you prepared to tell us what areas you would like to see more action on?
Well, again, I think if you'd have asked me that question 6 months ago, I'd be saying, well, where is the renewable energy coming from? There's lots of talk about it, but what's happening? And of course, we've just seen that the MUA have commissioned an engineering report from WSP. So that, to me, it looks as though the authority is taking steps to set out its path by which it can deliver what's been asked for by government.
We had a target when I was in government, 15% by 2015. We now have a new target. Again, similar distance into the future. You're an optimist, so presumably you are optimistic that this target will be met this time, unlike all previous targets.
I think so. I mean, even if we look back at the Electricity Act of 1996, there's an obligation on the authority to use renewable energy where practical. And of course, they haven't, other than a few little bits and pieces with the Sulby Reservoir, and arguably the energy from waste plants, although I wouldn't class that necessarily as green or renewable. But again, the 15% by 2015, I pointed this out. I questioned the Manx Utilities Authority here in this room, in fact, during the Environment and Infrastructure Policy Review session we had with them. And I asked them about these policies. What wasn't clear in 1996, what wasn't clear in 2015. And I think at those times there was always an argument that those renewable sources perhaps were more expensive than the alternative. Of course, what we have now is we've seen that crossover of cost between the cost of generating power by burning things compared to the cost from renewables, and that cost curve is now favouring renewables. And so we can see with the MUA's latest commissioning of that report is they do appear to be taking that seriously. And it also helps, I think, that there is now an Act of Tynwald that also provides legislative weight to these requirements that wasn't there in the past.
That was Rob Mercer, MLC. And finally, I interviewed Chris Thomas just after he steered the vehicle duty order through March Tynwald. He talks us through this complex and controversial issue. It is fair to say, though, that you have your detractors in Tynwald. Former Minister of DOI, Tim Krukle, was giving a history lesson, but his history only started in 2016 in relation to vehicle duty orders. I recall the history going much further back than that, and certainly when I was Infrastructure Minister myself, we were looking at the complete, well, I wouldn't say complete mess, but the muddled nature of the whole way in which we charge for road tax. It would appear, at least 10 years on, the department still hasn't managed to shed any clarity on the vagueness and confusion in relation to this.
Well, I hope I haven't got personal detractors, especially not in former Minister Crookall. I hope it's just about engaging with the policies. The department made a definite proposal, as I said in my statement, in 2017 to government, which couldn't get through council ministers when I was in council ministers. That was very forward thinking in your terms. We did that same thing again, and we actually got as far as putting it on the order paper, and then it was pulled back. It is pretty hard to get vehicle duty through, given the coalition of interests against it. We've established some important principles today. The first one is that all users, except for those like disabled people and people who drive motorcycles and veteran vehicle owners, will pay a minimum of £65 for their vehicle duty. That was a precedent that was set today. I've now launched a 1-year engagement process, and I would hope that the 2024 order, which will also come in 1st of April next year, I've now aligned it, second precedent is I've now aligned it again to the financial year. I hope that by that stage we have banded approaches based on emissions or weight or something that comes out of the engagement, very similar to all the proposals that have been made over the last 10 or 15 years, because there are, and perhaps taking more of fuel duty into account, and perhaps doing something imaginative with MUA about electric vehicles that are being charged at home on hugely discounted tariffs that are only available for electric vehicle users. We've got to get inside people's heads to end up with a consensus about what's fair, because ultimately we need to maintain roads. There are all sorts of users. They've got to pay a proportion. I gave the figure of £200 or a bit more that every user of the highways has got to pay to have enough revenue for us to maintain the roads and improve them where necessary and bring them back up to the standard we want, because there's lots of roads that sub-condition. It's difficult. It's hard to get through vehicle duties, as proved by the fact that nobody's managed it since 2020. And thank you very much to my Tynwald colleagues for voting for it today.
So, for the uninitiated then, obviously what used to be the case was vehicles were charged, or owners were charged on the size of the engine of their vehicles. Then we had the issue with electric vehicles, and there were either no charge or a very limited charge was suggested for those. Then we moved on to, well, maybe we should be charging based on emissions, and we ended up in a bit of a mess with this. Or when I say we, I mean Isle of Man government ended up in a bit of a mess. What do you think would be the fairest solution to all this?
So what I've challenged the officers to do is to summarise all the proposals they've made to council ministers, to the public, to Tynwald over the years into one document, which will be the basis of engagement. So we'll be writing all that down for you and giving people choices. We're not going to have a tick box consultation because that's a bit pointless. We're going to actually call for evidence about how we should be doing it and ask detailed submissions based on us presenting all of the alternatives just along the way that you described. I think you missed out weight-based approaches to it as well. There were 10,000 people who lose out from today's duty. The electric vehicles is quite a small number compared to the 10,000 people who have smaller vehicles or low emission vehicles who were paying lower than £65. That have had their duty increased to £65, and the proportionate increase would depend on how much lower than £65 you were applying previously. Thank you for them for beginning to share the load, but as I said, you're still being subsidised by the people who pay more than the £200 plus, which is the average vehicle duty that's paid, and we've got to come up with a system that's consensus. I think we achieved a lot today collectively in Tynwald because we did vote for an order in 2023, not having voted for one since 2020. I do hope that when I call for evidence about the future, I do hope that Treasury, environmental groups, the general public will make submissions about the evidence that we should be taking into account as we come up with the next order in 2024. It was a bit too much to go straight away to banded electrical vehicle charging, but we do have a plan along those lines, because there are some heavier and more expensive electric vehicles and there are some smaller ones, and why should all of those be paying £65 any more than everybody who uses a small amount of electricity for heating their home compared to a rich person who might be using subsidised electricity to heat their swimming pool? Why should they all get subsidised the same amount? We've got lots to come in this space.
I think one common belief is that you get far more money in by way of road tax than you actually pay out, and that is borne out when you look at the revenue expenditure of the department. What is perhaps conveniently forgotten by some political members is that back in 2010, I think it was, the then DOT had its revenue budget substantially cut, and a lot of the expenditure of the department was shifted into capital expenditure, which of course doesn't appear in quite the same way in terms of the revenue budget. So effectively, you are still spending the money, but you're spending it in a way that's not that obvious from the highways budget.
Yeah, in a very good Freedom of Information response was issued recently. More is spent on highways in the Isle of Man compared to what's raised for vehicle duty differently from in the UK. So there are also complete fundamental differences. So in the UK you have a first registration fee, which can be quite substantial. We don't have that in the Isle of Man. The point I tried to make clearly, was that we have many more roads per person in the Isle of Man than we do in the UK. So it's harder to pay for our roads. That's why, on average, people pay more than they would for the same vehicle across. We also have lots of people who try to play the system by not paying their vehicle duty, and people who stay too long on UK plates. So therefore, we're needing to up the enforcement, which there's been some quite public occasions when that's happened recently. And the reason why we haven't managed to do direct debit as yet is because our law doesn't actually work in terms of how we deal with people who are not paying their vehicle duty. It doesn't quite work for enforcing it when you miss a direct debit payment. And also it's quite difficult to put a system in place that meets modern expectations about vehicle duty. So, for instance, rates. You can't actually send in an electronic instruction. You actually do have to speak. And I now learn that there are 3 people who spend all of their time doing setting up rates finances. It's not exactly a model system. So we've got a lot of work to do in all sorts of ways. People get the condition of the roads that they pay for. It's nice to think that there's red tape, bureaucracy and waste, but there isn't too much red tape, bureaucracy and waste and bad decisions. Basically, the more that's raised for highways, I can absolutely promise you that it's more likely that the pothole outside your house and the residential streets where you live will be fixed sooner. We've got a strategic network that needs some work in Ballasalla village, that needs some work between Fairy Bridge and Santon. Every year we have to improve the TT course because of a request from the ACU. We're doing loads of work, and I do think that I certainly get lots of compliments now from people that are very pleased with the work that's been done. I also get loads of complaints that work hasn't been done and that some of the work has been overtaken by the weather, because it's a pretty difficult place to do highways and things do go wrong, but people have to remember we have warranties and defects periods. Basically, I do hope that the Department of Infrastructure can work with this group of Tynwald members, and by 2026 we can have a system for financing our highways that's accepted as a consensus approach to fair financing of highways, and also meets our climate change ambition goals, and is also perceived as being fair to motorists. I've got Stu Peters in the department as the motorist champion, so I do get my ear bent regularly, and I really, really love the challenge that he provides, and I do hope that we can blend perfectly all the different perspectives around paying for our highways, and that we can actually make the highways better using public funds in line with what taxpayers, vehicle duty payers want for us to use their money for.
That was Chris Thomas, MHK. Are you convinced? Is the vehicle duty really a tax to pay for road improvements, or just another stealth tax? For now, though, I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.